All right, guys, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. Good to have you back. So this is going to be our Nuclear Medicine 4333 class. This is quality assurance. Hopefully, all of you have gotten onto Canvas already and noticed that I posted a video of kind of the introduction to this class. I will probably briefly repeat some of that this morning, just to make sure we're good on everything. You know what's expected. But if you haven't watched that video, it's just on the homepage of Canvas. Go and check that out, and we'll it'll allow you to get started. Hopefully, you've already been able to kind of get started and start looking at things. Also, I'll just remind you here that I have the same thing for our comprehensive review class. If you go on Canvas and look, there's an introductory video. That class I don't have a lecture for, so please go watch that video so you kind of know how to get started. There's quite a bit there to do and things that need to happen before we do our boards review class, that's coming right up at June 5th and 6th. So if you haven't looked at those, please do so, and let me know if you have any questions. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And we're going to just quickly take a look at the quality assurance Canvas page and just make sure you know where everything's at and that you know how to get started. So let me just share. Oops. For some reason, it's not showing me my window. So I guess, hmm. Okay, can you guys see my Weber State Canvas page?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, good. When it brought up the little picture for me to select, it was just blank. So glad that you can see it and it's working. Okay, cool. So when you get into Canvas, here's your home page. This is the introduction video I was talking about. I would still watch that, even though I'm going to kind of briefly cover some of that now. I would still take a look at that if you have not. The first thing I have on here, of course, is the syllabus. So briefly going into the syllabus, just to highlight kind of what's here. Obviously, most of you have probably seen this because you're at least in attendance today. So that means you've gotten somewhere. So I just kind of had through the first week to look at the introduction video that can kind of get you started on a quality assurance manual, which is kind of what the main assignment for this class is. Today's May 15th, and so we're doing that Zoom lecture. We're going to lecture on a lot of, at least a big portions of what's in your quality assurance manual today. And then, of course, that manual is due by the 23rd. I've kind of put a point value here for the manual itself. And we'll talk more about the manual here in just a minute, but these are the point values for kind of what's involved with the manual and kind of what I expect. And those three main things are just, do you answer the objectives in the manual? Is it usable in the department as a quality assurance manual for somebody that works in the department? And then is it a good reference for your registry study? And so that's all worth 1,000 points. Again, due by June 23rd. And again, I'm kind of going quick. I don't want to spend too much time because I've covered some of this, but there's that. Back to the home page, we'll quickly look at our QA manual, and then we'll get into the lecture today. And I've put the slides there. Hopefully some of you have seen that. If you want to follow along in slides, you've got that there. Okay, so here's our quality assurance manual module. So this module is going to basically lead you through creating a quality assurance manual that's going to help you, number one, be able to study for boards. Quality assurance kind of covers all of the things you need to know in terms of quality assurance in an imaging department, and also a lot of the federal regulations and those things that I guarantee are going to be on your boards, and we'll go over a lot of that today. So I won't kind of read every facet of this, but I will kind of point you to how this is set up. So there's 7 sections. Here's section 1. It gives you some things to do. For example, number 1, identify the purpose, priorities, requirements, and goal of a quality assurance program in nuclear medicine department. Who should be involved? What's important about having a license to image in a department? How do you get that license? Is your state an agreement state? So these are questions that you're going to go and answer and figure out. Now, I said on the other video, and I'll remind you again, that I want you to make this quality assurance manual based on the department that you're in now. So you're going to have some sections that are kind of generally go to any department, right? They apply to any department. And then you're going to have stuff that's going to be specific to yours, okay? And so you want to do this based on the department you're in now. The other thing I will give you as a caveat before we kind of go through the rest of this is that I don't want you to have to recreate the wheel with this. So if your department has some of these things that are asked of you in this manual already established, you can use your department's things as long as they give you permission. You need to ask for permission to use that from a manager or whomever it might be. And then you can include those things in your manual. So you don't have to recreate the wheel, but I want you to go through the process of putting this together, because that's kind of the learning of what's required and being able to answer these questions, okay? So keep that in mind. So section 2 is patient scheduling, management, and satisfaction. You'll notice just on the first, again, I won't go through all of these, but just on the first couple, they're going to ask you to develop a scheduling sequence and then also preps. And the idea behind these is that if you're schedulers or your nursing floor or another department like X-ray, will they know what the preps are for your nuke med studies? Okay, do they know what the preps are so that they can schedule those things appropriately? Do they know what sequence to put them in? You know, for example, you may not want to have a gastric empty and an upper or lower GI study set up, you know, back to back. And if they are going to be back to back, you're probably going to want to do the gastric empty study first before you have a bunch of barium in the stomach, right? And you're going to have problems with not being NPO and things like that. So just want you to look at the studies that you do in your department and just say, are there any of these studies that we need to tell a nursing staff, tell the floor, or tell scheduling that have to be scheduled in a certain order? And then what are the preps for those studies? What preps need to be told to the patient right up from even the scheduling point of view? Okay, so that's kind of those first ones. Then they talk about creating a patient satisfaction questionnaire, other considerations for patients. So again, that's kind of the things that you're after in this section. The next one is section 3, which is nuke med staff considerations. And so this talks about the importance of staff learning, orientation, how to explain nuke med imaging to patients, to staff, just having your staff know what's going on and how to do things in your department, right? Section 4 is radiation protection and personnel monitoring, and we're going to go over a lot of that today. Section 5, radiopharmaceutical dosage, transport, hot lab. A lot of this section is like your federal regulation stuff that we'll look at today. And then section 6 is instrumentation and quality control. And so this is where you'll notice on number 2, develop a step-by-step procedure for each quality control listed below. So I've got like survey meter, well counter, dose calibrator, gamma camera, spec system. Essentially what I want you to do is you're gonna, if I were a tech and I was new and I needed to know what I'm supposed to do for quality control for my gamma camera, I can open up your manual and be like, okay, this is what I need to do. So what that means then is that it's going to be slightly different possibly for each one of your areas. This is why I'm having you do this. This is why this course is somewhat of an independent study, because you're going to go to the cameras you have in your department now, and you're going to create this based on those cameras, right? So everyone's might look a slightly different. If you have a pet camera in your department, then do a pet camera too. If you have a gamma camera, there's going to be things that you do or don't have, but at least cover these things. Along with that, what will be a part of this section is what are the quality controls that you do daily, on your gamma camera. What do you have to do daily? What do you have to do weekly? What do you have to do monthly? And all those things, of course, have been covered in previous classes. When we did our instrumentation classes, we talked about all of these different systems and when those things are required. So that's the kind of stuff that's going to be listed in this section. And again, you'll do it for whatever is in your department. And then section 7 talks about new equipment purchase process, how you get new equipment, how you kind of test that new equipment, how everything comes together so that you can have a new piece of equipment. This one, I'll be honest with you, this one is going to be heavily reliant upon you going and talking to one of probably your managers in the department that goes through this process, and they may even point you to someone other than that. But I just want you to go and talk to those people, and there's really not a right or a wrong with this section. I just want you kind of asking those kind of questions, like what do we do to get new equipment? What's the process? Do we bring in physicists to help set up our equipment? What does it have to go through? What's qualified to get the equipment? So that's what you're after in section 7. And again, you're going to have to talk to somebody at your facility to kind of figure some of that out. Okay, so that kind of asks the questions. That's the first half of the module. And then, of course, the second half of the module is the learning activities. And I've tried to point you to places in the books as much as possible, but also, point you to people in your department. Again, a lot of this is going to come from your book, and then a lot of it's going to come from talking to people in your department and finding out, the things out of your department. Again, keep in mind, you can use the stuff they have if they already have it established. I'm okay with that. I want this to be a learning experience and not a busy work thing. Okay. So again, learning activities, you'll just go through, and each section has a learning activity that will kind of take you through where to find the information. Okay. So with that, any questions? If not, we'll move on to our actual lecture. Okay. I'm going to assume that's clear as mud then. Did someone have a question? I heard somebody. Okay. Maybe it was just a laugh. Thanks for laughing at my dumb joke.
So Michael,
Yeah.
do we just fill out, we just do each one of those sections like one at a time?
So when you're done, that's a great question. Thank you. So when you're done, what I want to have is a document that's all together, right? So just like I said, what you're developing is a manual that could sit in your department and be opened up and looked at. So you can so I want your manual to be labeled in the same way that this document is. So when I open up your manual, I want it to say section 1, establishment administration, and then just go 1, 2, 3 and just answer those questions. Some of those like I said, could slightly look different than this. For example, when you get down to this section about quality control, you may have if you don't have a PET scanner, that won't be listed. If you do, it will, so that it might look slightly different than this. But yeah, follow this pattern pretty much to the T, and all of it in one document to be turned in at the end. Because again, I want you to be able to open it and look at it. In fact, I'll tell you, and I can't remember if I said this on the video, so sorry if I'm repeating myself too much, but I work with a tech right now who, when he got done with school, there was a small hospital that was opening here in Utah, and he got hired as the new med tech, and they didn't have anybody else. It was kind of like a one tech department, but he was the original guy hired. And so he had to kind of help set up some of the quality assurance. And he literally took his manual and used it as the department quality assurance manual and what they kind of based everything off. Now, I'm sure he had some things that he changed around and so forth, but that's the idea, is you're creating a manual that, again, number one, we want to help learn all this stuff with boards. Number two, could it actually be used in the department for what its purpose would be? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so it's not each section isn't going to be individually due on their own. It's just kind of work through it one by one and then turn it all in as a complete document at the end.
You got it. Perfect. Yep, that's exactly what I want. Thanks for the questions. Anybody else? Okay. All right. Oh, we had somebody. Is that you, Jamie?
No, I'm good.
Okay. All right. Well, let me get rid of this. We'll stop share on this and then we'll get to our lecture. Okay. Can you guys see the slides?
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay. All right. So this will be quality assurance. What I've done on this first slide is I just listed out the quality assurance manual and those 7 sections, just so you can kind of see. And I want to just kind of go over what we'll cover today so you have an idea of what we'll have and what we won't. I will say, I think I mentioned this in the other video, but this class used to be just solely an independent study course. With just kind of me guiding you through with questions as needed. I've found that your summer semester is so busy that as I started doing this for a few years, I realized that you guys are all just stressed out of your minds and there's a lot to do because of the short semester. So I'm trying with this lecture, I'm trying to take some of the burden off you while still allowing you to have a way to learn. And so that's kind of what this lecture will be, is me trying to at least take a lot of this stuff, and especially the stuff I'm going to cover today, I know will be in your boards and will be questions on your boards. So what I'm trying to do with this lecture is kind of gather a lot of the stuff that you don't have to go out and find. You're going to have to do a lot of it on your own, the stuff that has to do with your department, but a lot of the federal regulation stuff, I'm going to be able to help gather for you today. And then it's just a matter of like learning and memorizing, right? So with this, we're gonna cover most of what you would see in section 1, not every little bit, but most of it. Most of what you'll see in section 4 and in section 5. Okay, so that's kind of what we'll cover today. So the first question, as we get into this, is what is quality assurance? What do we mean when we say quality assurance? I'm going to kind of flip this on you right out of the gate a little bit, because the reality of it is if you're working in nuclear medicine today, or you talk to any managers of hospitals, they're not going to call it quality assurance, because what covers kind of generally everything is referred to as quality management. And that's the term you'll hear today. The reason why we still call this class quality assurance is because
Probably that much per camera, anything?
Somebody's not muted.
Yeah, you didn't vote then.
There we go. We call it quality assurance because that's what Weber State calls this class. So I didn't want to flip it and call it quality management and kind of confuse everybody. But in reality, if you hear things talked about, it's probably going to be called quality management. And quality management really has kind of 3 parts to it. But essentially, quality management is just how do we look at and increase quality outcomes, reduce failures, and then have compliance to federal regulation in a nuclear medicine department. That's kind of what quality assurance or quality management is about. So under those 3, or under that umbrella, you have quality improvement, you have quality assurance, and then you have quality control. So quality improvement is kind of like more systemic or organization wide, right? That's going to be kind of highly approached from like a managerial, whether that, management in your actual nuke med department, but also overall like hospital or facility type management is going to be quality improvement. Then quality assurance is, when we think of that, we're thinking heavily about compliance with our federal regulations and professional standards and protocols. So we're going to talk a lot today about the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which is one of the big regulatory organizations that we have to deal with. We'll talk about a couple other ones, but that's kind of the main one. So that's what I want you to think of when you think of the term quality assurance itself. And then, of course, there's quality control, which is like your daily, weekly, monthly, equipment stuff. This is the stuff that you guys do every day when you go in to your clinicals and you set your camera up. That's kind of your quality control. So again, quality management, under there we have quality improvement, quality assurance, and quality control. So let's talk about who is involved in quality management. Really, you could say everybody in a nuclear medicine department in a facility is involved, but those kind of break down into some individual responsibilities. So the first one I've listed here, of course, is management. And like I mentioned a second ago, that can be, management for your individual department, but this would also be like hospital-wide type management. So they're of course overall quality improvement. They're involved in kind of everything. So you'd have management at each level. One of the first individual specific people that you have to be involved in quality management is the authorized user. So an authorized user is an overseeing physician. They've gone through training and qualification through the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and they've met certain requirements, and they're actually given, they're identified on your license. So the license that you seek from the NRC, you'll have a physician that's identified on that license as the overseeing physician, or what they call the authorized user, okay? So with an authorized user, all radioactive material that you have in your department or that you give to patients has to be pursuant to an order, or you might say prescription, by the authorized user. So every dose you get from a radio pharmacy, whether or not you know this, it's been ordered under a doctor, right? That authorized user. You can look, and on the labels that you get with your doses, usually you can find whatever doctor is your authorized user. They'll be listed on there, and it's much like those count like a prescription for your patients. Also, authorized users issue written directives where required. You're going to see that with most of your therapies, I-131 treatments, things like that. They'll have written directives, and that's just paperwork that has to be filled out that goes along with those therapies that have been required. And so you'll see kind of authorized user, that's their main job or part of quality management that they are. And you can, if you go into usually it's posted in the hot lab, you can usually find your license, and you'll see that the authorized user is listed on the license, and your license has to have an authorized user. The next person we got listed here is the radiation safety officer. Usually they're like a health physicist or medical physicist, and they kind of have lead responsibility over the radiation safety program throughout the facility. So this isn't just an individual that's over nuclear medicine, but this is throughout facility wide. So if you have, in some of the stuff they do in like radiation therapy, all throughout the hospital, anywhere where radiation is involved, you're going to have a radiation safety officer that they're going to have a facility-wide program. They'll have specific stuff for nuclear medicine, but there's a facility-wide program that they're kind of in charge and that they lead. Their responsibilities include investigating any overexposures to a patient or any accidents like spills and things like that. They establish written policies and procedures relative to using radioactive materials in your facility. And then they usually lead the RSC, which is the Radiation Safety Committee, which is the next thing I have listed here. So within your hospital, you're going to have a committee that sets policy for your institution in regards to radiation and radioactive materials. So they're responsible for the use, and under your license, you should have a radiation safety committee. Usually you'll have individuals from different areas where radioactive materials might be involved in your hospital. You'll have a rep from each of those areas. The Radiation Safety Committee has to include the radiation safety officer, and again, usually they're the lead of that committee. Then you usually have like a nursing rep or a management rep, or again, anywhere where radioactive materials are used. Now, the Radiation Safety Committee might not be required, and it kind of depends on your license type, and we'll go over license types in a minute. But for larger facilities or smaller facilities, you have different size licenses. So typically for a larger facility, you're going to see the Radiation Safety Committee led by the Radiation Safety Officer. However, in some small clinic type facilities, you might just have a Radiation Safety Officer, and they essentially just are the Radiation Safety Committee. Now, even when it's just a Radiation Safety Officer, you're probably still going to have a very small committee, maybe like a manager or something like that. But the RSO can kind of oversee the Radiation Safety Committee. But again, go look at your license. It's going to be based on your license. Your license, if you're in any kind of larger facility, your license is going to require to have the committee on top of the RSO. And then the last thing I'd put on here, of course, is you guys, the technologists, and we're kind of involved in all these aspects as well. And so I basically just listed the previous slide there, quality improvement, quality assurance, and quality control. Okay, so that's who's involved.
Can I ask a question? Can I ask a question real quick?
Yep, go for it.
What would you like? What would you say a bigger facility is? Like, is it by how many machines you have, or how do they determine that?
Yeah, so and we'll talk a little bit about this in a couple slides, but like they typically will go and they'll usually base it off of what types of exams you're doing. And they'll look at needs. So if you're like a small clinic and you're wanting to do some kind of, say you're wanting to do big therapies or something, they may reserve that for hospitals that have the facility to be able to kind of oversee that kind of thing. Like let's say you're doing an I-131 therapy and you've got a really big doses that you're using. Your license will specify the amount of radioactivity that you're able to hold at your facility. So there's not a standard cut rule, but you apply for a license through the NRC or through your state if they're handling it for the NRC. And we'll talk about that as well here in a minute. And so they kind of look at all of those things. They look at how big your facility is. They look at what you're going to be doing there, and they'll give you a license based on that. So it just happens to be that most smaller facilities don't have the infrastructure to handle what they consider, more, I don't want to say dangerous, but more involved procedures. And so usually you'll have a smaller license that allows you to have less radioactive materials, or you'll have a larger license which allows you to have more radioactive materials. And that's usually kind of what it's based on. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome.
Hey, Mike.
Yeah.
I had a question.
Go ahead.
And you might have covered this earlier, and this might be a little bit off track, but are these
Okay.
all going to be on like PDF format, slide format, where we can access again these slides?
Yeah, it's on Canvas right now. If you go on Canvas, there's a link that says slides, and it should be
Okay.
there. Let me know if you guys don't see it. It should be there. I went on there last night and made sure it was there. But
Fantastic. Cool. Thank you so much.
yeah,
Appreciate
no
that.
problem. No, it's a good question. Yep. But yeah, I definitely want you to be able to have this because all this stuff is kind of definite board stuff. So
Yeah. Thank you.
okay. All right. Yeah, no problem. So federal agencies. I mentioned the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the NRC. They're the main one we deal with. I mean, most of our stuff comes from that. We're also going to deal with the Department of Transportation and then the Food and Drug Administration, so DOT and FDA. The NRC is responsible for regulation of the purchase, receipt, and disposal of radioactive materials. There's something called Title 10 CFR. This is a document that lists the nuclear regulatory, radioactivity, how it can be used, how it can be disposed of. It's kind of the regulation document. And we'll look at that here in just a second. But we need to talk about what an agreement state is. What an agreement state is that by agreement with the NRC, your state can apply and come up with an agreement with the NRC that they will be the ones that oversee the radioactive materials for the state. And so they basically apply for that if they want to be the ones that cover it. So in some of your states, you might be just covered by the NRC, and they would be the ones that regulate you and then maybe come and do checks and things like that. And then in some states, if they are an agreement state, then you're going to have a state agency that does that. Okay. Now the rule I want you to remember, and probably a boards type question, is that if a state is going to be an agreement state, the state regulations have to be at least as strict, excuse me, at least as strict as the NRC. So your state might have stuff that's more strict than the NRC, but they can't be more lax than the NRC. That's part of their agreement with the NRC. So just remember that. That would be a board type question, is that what is an agreement state? So number one, know what it is. Number two, know that it has to be at least as strict as the NRC guidelines to be able to be an agreement state. Okay. And then again, DOT they control the packaging and the interstate movement of hazardous materials. Interstate is mentioned here, and I think we mostly say that because the federal government kind of is in charge of interstate travel, right? And so, however, the DOT, even if it's not from state to state, if it's just the travel of radioactive materials within your state, the Department of Transportation is still the ones that covers that. So just when you think of DOT, just think anytime we're talking about how to package it, how it moves, and how it's received and all that stuff, all that's going to be under Department of Transportation. And so we'll go over some of that. And then FDA, they regulate any kind of pharmaceutical. So radiopharmaceuticals still fall under pharmaceuticals because they're an administered thing that you administer to people, right? So they cover that's why the FDA is involved there. Okay, so Title 10 Code of Federal Regulations. Again, I listed here that's essentially the federal regulation that regulates nuclear use. I've got a link right here I'll click on. So this link actually takes you to the government website where Title 10 is listed. Can you guys see that? I'm hoping that stayed on the screen.
Yeah,
What I want you to okay, great, thank you. What I want you to look at here is you've got how many parts. These aren't just like pages; these are parts. So parts 1 through 199. There's 200 parts to this. So this document is anything radioactive materials throughout the United States. So it isn't just nuclear medicine, but it's anything with materials. So this could be like nuclear power. Anything that uses this has regulations under Title 10. And so again, not everything in here applies to me and you, right? There's just specific parts in Title 10. Like one of them is Part 20 right here, Standards for Protection Against Radiation. So there's parts that apply to us and parts that don't. So I put this link in here. You can look at this, but you probably won't. If you come in here and try to look at it, you're going to be just like filtering through a plethora of information to try to get to where you are. But that's where Title 10 is located, and that's what they use for our federal regulations. Now, if you look, I'll point you to one other source which is way better. But in your Bullis book that you have for our review class, if you go to the back, there is an awesome appendix. It's Appendix A, Federal Regulations. And what they've done is they've actually grabbed from Title 10, they've grabbed all the different sections that we use. So like we use a lot from Section 20, which is that radiation safety stuff. So a lot of Section 20 is listed in here. But it's like 3 or 4 pages of all of the types of regulations that we deal with. So it's all condensed. So great resource. Go take a look at that. And that's everything listed in one easy place to look at. So it's really nice for boards if you want to look through. Also, just in your review book in general, when they go through like the section for radiation safety and stuff, a lot of that is really condensed down. A lot of that I'm going to show you on our slides today, but it's really good in here in terms of not being super wordy and just breaking it down. So I would recommend using that as a resource. And I believe I pointed in your manual as you go through, I've pointed to that book for that same purpose. So take a look at that. Okay, so let's talk about our license. So to operate a nuclear medicine department, you have to have a license. The NRC allows for 2 types of licenses. This is broad scope and limited scope. And so this is kind of what we were referring to earlier when Joe asked the question about kind of department sizes and things like that. So the broad scope regulations are listed in 10 CFR 33 and then the limited in 10 CR 35. So For your boards, you don't need to necessarily know all the details of what's required for a limited or a broad. I would say just understand that there's broad scope and there's limited scope. And what I would understand as part of that is that it is this kind of third bullet point is that it varies by the amount of radioactive material allowed on a license. Okay. So when you list a broad scope, they even break it down into an A, B, or C, A being the largest amount of radioactive material allowed. So with a broad scope, you can have A, B, C, and then there's also just a limited scope, which is usually those smaller hospitals. Along with a broad scope and a limited scope, you will also have your doses the range of how they can vary changes with a broad scope or a limited scope with each of these. So sometimes with a broad scope license, they'll say, you can be within, I'm just kind of making something up, but you can be within, 25% of your where your dose is supposed to be when you put it in the dose calibrator, and maybe for a limited one, they may bring that down a little bit. So with a broad scope, they allow more radioactive materials and they're a little more lenient on how that works, whereas limited, they kind of come down a little bit more. So again, just know that there's a broad scope and a limited scope varying by the amount of radioactive materials allowed. Okay, so as we get into the rest of this, we're going to go through a lot of the safety regulations and how much dose the public and the patients and us as workers are allowed. And so we need to talk about radiation dose quantities and units and kind of hopefully clear up a little bit of mud and just remind us of what each of these means. And for those of you that have been through X-ray, this is probably a little bit of a review, but it's good to kind of get in our brains before we move on with the rest of this. So when we talk about radiation exposure, we measure that in Ranktons, and what that means is a Rankton is radiation measured in the air. Okay, so we're going to talk about MR per hour. So, and then that's the US unit, and then the SI unit, or the Standard International Unit, is column per kilogram. We use the MR per hour. So when you're out, doing your morning measurements and things, you're going to be measuring an MR per hour. You're measuring radiation just in the air. Okay. The next one is absorbed dose, and this is grays or rads, being the SI unit or the US unit. This is absorbed dose. So this is the amount of energy deposited in a given mass or tissue. Okay. So again, think of this one as I'm measuring things in the air. Absorbed doses, now we're talking about what's happening within tissue within a person. Okay. And so this is the one where when we had our physics and instrumentation class, I talked about how 100 of the old equals 1 of the new. So I listed that down here. Excuse me. So that's absorbed dose. Then you have radiation weighted dose or dose equivalent. That can be listed in sieverts or REM, which stands for radiation equivalent man. So this accounts for absorbed dose, like in other words, the energy deposited in part of the tissue. But then this also qualifies or takes into account the type of radiation. So we're talking about gamma, beta, what kind of radiation is happening. And this is more of a measure of the ability of a radiation type to produce biological effects. So that's your dose equivalent, your radiation weighted dose. This one is they take absorbed dose and multiply it by some kind of radiation. It's a modifying value or a quality factor, and I'll show you on the next slide. So for example, if you look here, you have X-ray, gamma, beta, or all give a quality factor of 1. And sort of the absorbed dose equivalent is 1. Now that's nice because we can say that when we're looking at MR or we're looking at dose, it's a 1-to-1 ratio. Most of the stuff we look at is going to be a 1-to-1 ratio. And you might be asking yourself, well, then why even worry about it? So I'll qualify that in a second, but let me look at this. Let's look at this a little more. You'll notice when we get down to alpha particles, like we've talked about before, are very large particles, so they have a lot of damaging ability. However, remember, they don't travel very far. And remember how I talked about an alpha particle isn't even strong enough to get, so they're large in terms of damage, but they're not strong, so they can't even get through a sheet of paper. So your alpha particles have some possibility of some skin type damage, but they're not going to do anything deep tissue. And so because of that, they give a quality factor of 20, and notice that this dose, the absorbed dose, goes down by quite a bit, right? So for general exposure, it goes down a little bit. And then of course, we don't even need to talk about these other two. We don't mess with them. So it's usually a 1-to-1 factor. Now, the reason you might be like, well, then why even, like I said, why even worry about it? And the reason I kind of brought this up is that you're going to see things that are in the books as you're studying that are said, a federal regulation that says it can't be more than such and such MR per hour for something, right? And then you're going to see other ones that say millirem per hour. And so what I just want you to kind of put in your brain is that when we're talking about MR per hour, it's going to be something where we're measuring something in the air. And when we introduce millirem or MREM, we're talking about dosing our patient. Again, also when we're talking about sieverts, we talk about there's so many sieverts of something. You're talking about now about a person and patient dose and tissue, okay? I bring that up because as you're going through your book, they don't always distinguish. They'll just throw those things in there, and it's up to you to pay attention to whether it's talking about MR per hour or whether it's talking about REM or sieverts to be able to really understand it better, okay? The last thing I'll put in here, and this is kind of ultimately what we look at when we talk about federal regulations, is we talk about effective dose equivalent. So what this does is it adds an additional modifying factor to the absorbed dose, which was this one here, and that accounts for the relative radiosensitivity of different organs or a tissue weighing factor. So again, think of all the things we have involved. We have radiation just in and of itself, right? So radiation in the air, you can say there's this much radiation, or you could say I have 20 millicuries of something and it's giving off a certain amount of MR per hour. But then you have to think, as I take that dose and I put it in, now you have the tissues being radiated, but some tissues are more sensitive than others. So depending on what I'm doing, if I put TEC inside someone, I have a certain energy. And if I put I-131 in someone, I have a certain energy. Along with that energy difference, I-131 also is going to collect in my thyroid. So now there's something, now one specific organ is getting most of the dose, right? So all these things they kind of take into account. And so just know that a lot of the stuff we're going to look at when we talk about patient dose is going to be this effective dose equivalent. It's why you can't, you might think to yourself, well, can I just say I have 20 millicuries and then that means this is how many sieverts or grays I'm giving to my patient in dose? And the reason you can't just make an easy equivalence is because, again, in nuclear medicine, we design our nuclides to go to certain organs and do certain things, and different organs have different radiosensitivity. And so it can get confusing. You don't necessarily need to be able to figure any of that out for your boards, but you need to understand the difference as you're going through these regulations to understand what the regulation is saying and what you're dealing with, okay? And then I brought up the law of, I always get these names wrong, but I think it's Burgony and Tribundow. Someone else might say that different, I don't know. But the law of Burgony and Tribundow states that cells are most sensitive to radiation when they're immature, undifferentiated, and rapidly dividing. So undifferentiated just means that they're not developed into a specific cell type, right? And so this is kind of where that principle of effective dose equivalent comes from, is that depending on the part of the body, different parts of the body have different radiosensitivity, okay? All right, so now we can start talking about the dose limits and the things that with our patients, okay, and with us and the public and so forth. So this is stuff that you're just gonna have to memorize. Again, I will point you to this book because it's going to condense it down even more than what I have on the slide, but for teaching purposes, I have a lot of information on the slide. Look in some of these books. Also, your Waterstrom book has some good graphs that kind of condense this down into simple charts as well. So I would look at both of those. But essentially the dose, so when we talk about public annual dose limits, this is dose received by any member of the public from exposure to radiation or radioactive material by a licensee. Okay. So when we talk about public exposure, we're not saying like the public's out and they go on an airplane ride and get a little bit of radiation from being closer to the sun, or they get background radiation. We're talking about this is regulated based only on what a licensee is doing. Okay. So none of those other things count for radiation exposure. This is us doing this to a patient or someone even just in our department. Okay. So the limit on that is 100 millirem or 0.1 millisieverts. Again, notice those are rems and sieverts because we're talking about a person. Okay. So effective dose equivalent. Effective dose equivalent. Dose in any unrestricted area in any 1 hour. So if you have to think about that in your department, if during any 1 hour someone is likely to receive 2 millirem per hour or 0.02 millisieverts, then that also is a restricted or a limit. Okay, so this is just general public. Okay, now occupational limits. The annual limit is going to be whichever is more limiting out of these two. Now, this first one's super easy to understand, and this is the one I want you to this is definitely a memorized thing, okay? So total effective dose equivalent that you can have as an occupational worker is 5 rems or 50 millisieverts. I promise you that's on your test, like guaranteed, okay? So the total effective dose is either 5 rems or 50 millisieverts, or, and this is, I took this right out of the wording from the NRC, so it's a little confusing. So let me just kind of read it through and then I'll explain really what we're saying. But it's the sum of deep dose equivalent, and I added this kind of, think of external dose coming in, and the committed dose equivalent, think of something you've put inside, to any individual organ or tissue other than the lens of the eye being equal to 50 rems or 0.5 sieverts. So essentially what this is saying is if you had, I highlighted this individual organ or tissue. So I want you to think of this as one of your organs got radiated severely. So this is not likely to happen to you as a worker. There's just not a lot of ways for us to have one organ that's highly exposed. So not likely that you're ever going to experience this. But what it would mean is if I thought of an example, let's say you have an I-131 capsule and it's a really, really large dose because they're really trying to ablate someone's thyroid, and you decide to go in the hot lab and pop the pill and drink it. Okay, that might qualify because now your thyroid is probably going to hit these limits. Okay, so it's not going to happen, but that is how the NRC qualifies it. What I would advise you is that, again, memorize this first one, understand that there's this other way that it can happen as well, and it has to do with an individual organ. Okay, and that one's the 50 and 0.5. But the one that you're going to just generally have as an occupational worker is 5 rems and 50 millisieverts. The annual limits to the lens of the eye, to the skin of the whole body, and to the skin of the extremities are as follows here. So the lens of the eye is 15 rems or 0.15 sieverts. Shallow dose equivalent, which is essentially just like a dose that's not strong but exposes your skin or extremities, is the same again as the individual organ one. It's 50 rem or 0.5 sieverts. And then the other bullet point I put down here is that annual dose reports have to be kept for 3 years. I promise you that's a question as well. So 2 guaranteed ones. You're probably going to get this lens of the eye one. You're probably going to get the dose report ones, have to be for 3 years. And I guarantee you'll get the occupational exposure. So make sure you memorize those 3. Obviously kind of know all of these, but I guarantee those 3 for sure. The other one is that minors are limited to 10% of the occupational limit. So this isn't public minors. This is if you have a minor that happens to be working in your department. You're obviously not going to have like a tech that's a minor, but you know, maybe there's departments out there where, you know, a high school kid is working as a scheduler or a front desk person. And so if they're anywhere in it around a nuke med department, their limit is 10% of the occupational limit. The other big one is pregnant occupational limits. So there's specifics for pregnancy. It's limited to 50 millirem per month, 500 millirem over the gestation period. Okay. Now this qualifies after the pregnancy is declared. So what I mean by that is that if you are a tech or a radiation worker that is pregnant, by law, you do not have to disclose that you're pregnant. they've left that as I'm assuming it's mostly like a HIPAA type of thing, right? So you do not have to declare your pregnancy. Now, of course, I would, because you're going to want to protect your baby or the fetus from, radiation exposure that we don't need to have happen. But once you declare, that's when these limits fall in place. Once you declare, then from that point going forward, you can't have more than 50 millirem per month or 500 over the total gestation period. Okay. If you declare your pregnancy, then your facility is required to have any pregnant person wear a separate film badge at the level of the abdomen. That film badge is going to be recording radiation dose for the fetus. And then, like I mentioned here, it's not required to declare pregnancy.
I just have a quick question.
Yeah, go for it.
It's kind of on the topic of pregnancy. If we have a patient that is pregnant and they come in for like a HIDA, I know it kind of happened the other day. It was an inpatient, they were pregnant, and someone had to figure out how much dose the baby was getting.
Mhm.
How do you figure that out? Do you know?
To be honest with you, I don't. I'm betting that the radiation safety officer got involved.
Okay.
There probably is information out there. I don't know it. That would not be something that would be on your test, but it is a good question. And even a question like that as to whether or not you even do the study, that's going to be something that your facility sets up in terms of, that's why you have a radiation safety officer. That's why you have the committee, is they're gonna go over issues like that. Like, is a HIDA scan worth doing on a pregnant patient? And what's the dose exposure? And a lot of times facilities will have a reason to say, okay, if X, Y, and Z is in place, then we'll say yes to this test. However, then we're going to take and we're going to cut our dose in half, or we're going to cut our dose in a fourth or something like that. But yeah, those are all good examples of stuff that would be the RSO's responsibility to determine. And if you ever get in a situation like that and someone comes in and they have an order and they're pregnant, like, that's what I would immediately do, is contact the RSO. You don't want to do anything that's outside of your scope of practice and outside of what is allowed on your license and allowed by your facility from the radiation safety perspective and committee and RSO. So does that help?
Yeah, that helps.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great question. Thanks. Okay. So we're going to talk about how we exposure monitoring. So how we keep track of those limits that we just talked about for us, for radiation workers. So you're going to wear a whole body dosimeter badge. We're going to go over kind of the different types of badges. Most techs refer to all of these as a film badge. Film badge really is only one type. So we'll kind of clear some of that mud, but even so, you're just going to hear people call them either badges or film badges. But a badge needs to be worn between the neck and the waist. It's exchanged monthly, bi-monthly, or quarterly. That kind of depends on who your facility has set up to monitor those badges. So usually there's companies that provide the badges and that will monitor those. And so it can be different depending on where you're at. Most places I've ever worked have been a quarterly, but it just depends. But those need to be worn between the neck and the waist. So if you have a tech that's putting them somewhere else, that isn't what you're supposed to do, because we're trying to measure or keep track of the main portion of the body where the organs are. That's the idea behind that. And then also in nuclear medicine, we have to have a ring badge. Your ring badge is supposed to be worn on your finger, not somewhere else on your body, which I see a lot of. I've probably even been guilty of that myself. And the ring badge, the thing I want you to remember here that could be like a test type question is that the ring badge has to be worn facing the palm. So there's a portion of your badge where you can see that the actual film badge is on. And so that actually needs to be turned inside because it needs to be close to where you're handling radioactive materials. If it's on the outside, then you're going to get a little attenuation from your finger. Obviously, it's going to be a small amount of attenuation, but they still want to be able to get an accurate measurement. And so you're supposed to have that on the inside. Okay, so that's how we wear, excuse me, that's how we wear our badges. So the first type is a photographic film, or this is the actual one that really is a film badge. And so the reason they call that a film badge is that inside that badge is an actual piece of film that gets exposed to radiation. That film is under a set of filters that are made of lead, copper, aluminum, and plastic. Okay, so the different lead, copper, aluminum, and plastic, essentially what that does is it provides a different amount of attenuation, and that's how they can tell the strength or the type of radiation exposure that you have, is that it's going to attenuate and block heavier things. So, you know, obviously the lead is going to be the most attenuating. So if where the lead filter is, if you have exposure there, that tells you something about the strength of that exposure, and copper, aluminum, and plastic, and so on. So again, the amount of darkening on a film is proportional to radiation. So, and then those allow the different energy range to be assessed. There usually is an opening in the badge where you might have plastic surrounding the whole badge, and then there's one portion where that plastic is gone and there's a hole, and that's for the exposure for beta and low energy particles, right? We talked about like an alpha particle not making it through a piece of paper. So if you have a plastic covering around your badge, you're never going to be able to see if you were exposed to beta. And so usually most of these badges will have some kind of hole in them for that purpose. The film badges are really adversely affected by heat and moisture. So with these badges, you want to keep them in your department. You don't want them to be in a high radiation area. So you should have some area, you know, at our facility, we have lockers and they're kind of away from everything else. And so you should have an area like that, but your badge should stay at work. And the reason for that is if you take it outside of work, then you don't know what exposure could be out and about as you go out to work. The other issue is I've seen techs that had it hanging on their lanyard, and they get in their car and they hang their lanyard on their rearview mirror or whatever, and then it sits out in a hot summer day, and that heat can ruin your badge and just completely overexpose the film. And so again, just affected by heat and moisture, and you want to keep them where you work. The next one is a TLD. So this uses a crystal instead of film, and that crystal is sensitive to exposure to radiation, right? So when it's exposed to radiation, it gives off light. So this is just like your scintillation, very similar to scintillation in our gamma cameras. So it gives off light, and that light is detected as how much radiation. The way that they get that data off is, and I listed that here, it's light, and then it's exposed to extreme high temperature. So when they take those to the facility, they give extreme high temperature, and when they do that, it gives off a certain amount of light from the crystal, and that's how they analyze kind of the radiation exposure there. And again, this also uses filters to assess the penetration and the energy range. These aren't as easily affected by the environment like your film badge, because it's a crystal and it takes really, really high temperatures to expose the radiation, or, well, I guess expose what radiation has occurred and give off the light. Once they're exposed, they're a one-time use. So once they're exposed to the high temperature, it essentially resets the crystal. So they can only be read out one time. So you're going to send these in. Your ring badges are TDLs. A lot of your badges are also TDLs. TDLs are super common. The film badge is really less common nowadays. They were used earlier on. And so I would bet that most of your badges are probably the TLDs. Did I say TDL? I have them listed. Just noticed that I have them listed two different ways. How confusing is that? Sorry. I've used this for a couple years and I didn't notice that. But the ring badges are, and so again, just be aware of that. That's probably the one you use mostly, one-time read. And then the other one is the optically stimulated laser, or the OSL. This uses a thin slice of aluminum oxide to detect it. And this one gives off light when it's exposed to a certain type of laser. So that's the way they measure it. The aluminum oxide, kind of same thing. It records the radiation exposure, and then some kind of laser process they put over it, and it gives off the dose. This one can be analyzed multiple times, so it doesn't get rid of exposure. I don't know exactly how that works with the laser, but I'm putting, enough here for you to at least understand what it is, which is what's going to be on your boards. I don't know the physics of how that works, but again, same principle, uses filters. This one's resistant to heat and moisture, so this one's nice in terms of being able to use over and over again and being pretty durable. But I think they're on the more expensive side. So again, most of the ones that I've seen or that you'll see are these TLDs up here. So those are kind of the three types that you need to know about and that you may run into. The other ones that I listed here are monitors that are instantly readable. One of them is a pocket ionization chamber, and then there's a digital pocket dosimeter. Essentially, these are small gas-filled chambers, the same as all the other gas-filled chambers that we learned about that we use to either measure or to measure doses or whatever. But it's just a gas-filled chamber that's exposed to radiation, and usually it has some sort of digital readout or even a monitor with a needle, just like on your measurement devices. And so it gives you instant live measurement. It's just they're small and you can actually just wear it on your side. I've never seen one in actual reality and practice. It shows some of them in your book that you can take a look at, but just understand that those are out there as well. I highly doubt you see any of those, but maybe. Okay, the other thing we need to talk about is bioassays. So bioassays are when you need to measure any radiation exposure that you might have. Now, really, you're probably only going to run into bioassays in one thing, and that's with I-131 therapies or treatments. So what bioassays do is they take into account any internal exposure due to inhalation. Now, I put inhalation in here because you'll notice on the first bullet point that this is required if the internal dose that you could get is likely to reach more than 10% of your annual dose limit. So when you think of things in our department that can be inhaled, you probably think of xenon, and you probably think of I-131 that is in liquid form. Again, not the capsules. If you use capsules, they're considered sealed, but if you use liquid, the liquid vials for your treatments, then that liquid can turn gaseous and get into the air. And so bioassays are required for I-131. Now, you might think, well, shouldn't they be required for xenon? We could get exposed to xenon and breathe in xenon. The problem is with the little amount that could get out with xenon and how small of a dose it is, and with the fact that xenon, is going to measure it in lungs, but that's it. You're not going to hit the possibility of getting 10% of your annual dose limit with xenon. Whereas with I-131, you could conceivably, with a large therapy dose, hit that 10% of your annual dose limit if you were somehow to get some of that liquid or breathe that, like the inhalation in. That's a possibility. Unlikely on all of it for the most part, but this is why they have bioassays. So bioassays are going to be usually done with, in terms of I-131, with a thyroid probe. Bioassays are going to be you as the tech, if you've been involved either with with handling a treatment for a patient, or you've been within a patient during administration, or you've handled pretty much anything handling the administration of I-131 treatment, then you're required to do a bioassay. And you're required to do it no earlier than 6 hours, but no later than 72 hours after you've been involved in the treatment. And that will essentially be you going in front of a thyroid probe and counting your thyroid. And any exposure that happens or anything that reads above background on that is going to have to be added to your exposure, your annual exposure report. So your badges and your rings, whatever company is handling those is going to send those back, and you're going to have an annual dose report for yourself that shows how much exposure you've had. If something shows up here, that's going to need to be added to that report. So typically, if you have something show up here, your radiation safety officer kind of oversees all that documentation. And so it'll need to be reported to them so they can add it to your dose and make sure that you continue to stay under the limits for the year. Okay. Okay, so that's kind of dose to us and what happens. Now we're going to talk about radiation areas and exposure from radiation sources that we have in our department and some signage and things. So in an unrestricted area, so this would be things like your waiting area, things like that, radiation has to be less than 0.2 millisieverts or 2 millirem in any 1 hour. Okay, now this is where I'm going to point to you. Notice I did that in millisieverts and millirems, which we're talking about people. But if you were to take your meter and go out, that it's going to be the same thing, because if you're measuring it in the air, again, remember we have that 1-to-1 ratio. So if we're talking about the exposure to the patient, which is what the regulations are concerned with, it's going to say it in millisieverts. However, if you're out doing this in your department and you're measuring things, you're going to be looking at it in millirem. Okay, so that's kind of where we try to mitigate that confusion. So no, in an area that's not a radioactive area, 0.02, it can't be greater than that in any 1 hour. So that's an unrestricted area. So restricted areas, the first restricted area, we would have to hang what's called a caution radiation area sign, which looks like this. This can't be greater than 5 millirem or 0.05 millisieverts in 1 hour at 30 centimeters. Okay, that's kind of a lot to throw in your head, but you need to remember that 0.5 millisieverts or 5 millirem in 1 hour. These measurements are going to be at 30 centimeters. The other one you're going to have is caution high radiation area. So I don't have one of those listed here, but it would say caution, and instead of radiation area, it would say high radiation area. That is anytime it would be greater than 100 millirem or 1 millisievert in 1 hour at 30 centimeters. Probably not going to be happening in your department. That's actually pretty high. Radiation therapy does some things where exposure can get upwards of that amount. You might see some radiation that high with possibly with certain therapies that you may or may not do. But again, if that's the case, then it has to be listed as a caution high radiation area. Okay. And then the other one is caution radioactive materials, which is this sign here. So this is more about where radioactive materials are located, the actual physical material itself. So this is about just any exposure. So this exposure could be from a nuclide, but it could also be from machinery or anything else. Whereas this is specifically has to be listed where radioactive materials are located. So this is going to be like in your hot lab, right? So this is the any time where any quantity of it is stored, potential presence of radioactive sources. The two things you definitely need to remember here that apply to, you generally say this with your hot lab, but really it's anywhere where you could have caution radioactive materials. Now in your department, those materials are going to be stored in the hot lab. So these are kind of the two rules that you'll probably get test questions on, is that we can't ingest food or drink. Those are both prohibited in a radioactive materials area, so in the hot lab. And then the other one is no smoking. So don't go into the hot lab and stick your smoke under the fume hood to try to like get rid of it. Don't do that. I'm sure that's happened before. So no smoking or application of cosmetics. Now that one's kind of funny. I'm like, I don't know, are there any of you out there that just want to go in the hot lab and put on your makeup? I don't know. But those are part of the federal regulations. No food or drink, no smoking, no putting on makeup in the hot lab or radioactive materials area.
Chapstick, maybe.
What was that?
Chapstick.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. They probably wouldn't want you to put chapstick on either. Just do everything out of the hot lab. That's all I can say.
Got it.
The other one that your book mentions is one called Extreme Danger Radioactive Area. I didn't put that on here, and I honestly don't think it's going to be on your boards. I think that the book was just putting it in there to be thorough, but this would be like listed at like a nuclear power plant. You're not going to deal with that kind of area anywhere in a hospital for any reason. So I did not list that here, and I don't think it's going to be on there, but it is in your book, so you can look at it if you want. But these are the three that you're going to need to be familiar with the signage on. Okay. And one other thing that I might mention here, when we look at these numbers, typically when you establish a department, and we'll talk a little bit about this when we talk about doing surveys, but typically when you would establish a department, you will go and you will take measurements with your survey meter in any area near the nuclear medicine department. And you'll do that daily or sometimes even twice a day when you initially establish. And that's how you come up with understanding and knowing where certain signs have to be posted. Like obviously the hot lab is going to have both the caution radiation area and the caution radioactive materials. But like you might have a waiting room that you wonder, does it need it? Does it need anything? And so you're going to have to do measurements when you establish a department, and you're going to have to check that out for a little while to know for sure. Same thing with insular areas, like, you know, maybe you have an injection room or whatever. In general, if you've established a department before, you can kind of assume some of those things. But if you hadn't, if you were doing this as a tech for the first time, you're just going to have to make measurements a couple of times a day until you establish kind of the background and then what exposures look like in those areas, so that if there are areas where exposure is a little more, then you can know which kind of signage to put in what area. So that's just more of a, you probably won't get that kind of a test question, but for your benefit as a tech, like if you ever have to go through that, that's kind of how you're going to establish that process. Okay, so now we're talking about the transports. This is when we get away from the NRC and we talk about the Department of Transportation or the DOT, okay? So they're the ones that establish these guidelines that are also, again, just things to memorize and put on your boards, okay? So remember, they do labeling, packaging, and delivery of radioactive materials. So when we talk about labeling, I've got the different types of labels, but they fall into three categories. The first one is white 1, then there's a yellow 2, and a yellow 3. So for a white 1, when you do a surface measurement, the dose rate cannot exceed 0.5 MR per hour. Now notice now, again, we're in MR now, not millirem, okay? That's why, because we're not doing a patient now, we're measuring a package, so we're just measuring radiation. So surface dose cannot exceed 0.5 MR per hour. So when you get a package in, it's a white 1, you measure it at surface, it can't be above that, okay? Radioactive yellow 2, the surface dose rate can't be more than 50 MR per hour. And at 1 meter, the dose rate must not exceed 1 MR per hour. So in both of these yellow ones, you're going to be measuring at the surface, and you're also going to be measuring at a meter away. A lot of your departments in their process will also still have you do the meter measurement with the white, but it actually isn't required by the DOT. So I've never been in a place that doesn't just do a surface and a meter measurement for all doses, but as far as DOT is concerned, they only want a surface measurement on white 1, okay? And just while we're talking about that, a good tip if your techs haven't shown you that I really have liked over the years to know if I'm a meter away, because like how do you determine if you're a meter? Do you get out like a ruler? A good way to do it is that most of your survey meters are going to have the part that has the graphic on it or whatever shows you the reading, and then you're going to have the head, and usually you're going to have a line in between that. That line is close to a meter. So if you take your measurement device and you hold the part where you can get the reading right at the dose, like so right at your package, and then you take your actual survey head and you pull it back to the end of that cord, you're roughly a meter. So just a tip. That's what I do. Makes it easy to know that I'm doing about a meter measurement. Again, it might not be perfect, but it's a good, easy way to get it quickly. So radioactive yellow 3, surface can't exceed 200 MR per hour, and at 1 meter, 10 MR per hour. So you're gonna have to measure you're gonna have to just memorize those. That's just the reality of it, is that's just a big memorization page, because you'll probably get these questions. Then the other thing that's listed on labeling is a transport index. And this is the number of MR per hour measured at 1 meter by the person who sent it. So when they packaged it up and got it ready for you, they did a meter measurement, and this is what they got as their measurement. It is not required for them to do that on a white 1, but it is required for yellow 2 and 3. Okay, so you'll notice over here on the labels that there's this little box right here on the 2 and the 3. That's where your transport index will be. So you'll see that transport index on the package when you're going into the hot lab to receive the doses. You won't see it on a radioactive 1. Okay, so that should be on those 2 labels. The maximum transport for common carriers. So when I say common carriers, this is people that aren't specific for radioactive materials. Like this could be the postal service or whatever. So common carriers can't have a travel index above 10. They can transport things below 10. If the travel index is above 10, then it has to be transported in a closed, exclusive use vehicle. So that would be a specific to radiation only. So most of your radio pharmacies are qualify under that specific use vehicle. But again, some areas get transported by a normal company depending on what's going on. So anyway, just remember that that number of 10 for common carriers, above 10 has to be specific. Okay, so now we're going to talk about how do you do that. So we talked about that measurement. How do you receive a radioactive package? How do you receive your doses? The first thing you should do when you're receiving a dose is visually inspect it. So you're going to look, what we're looking for is any leaking or any damage. So is anything wet going on in my package? Is anything damaged? Okay, either of those two. If either of those two are occurring, then you're going to want to stop and notify RSO, get management involved, because we're going to need to communicate with the facility that sent it and find out what's going on. The other thing you're going to do is you're going to measure those exposure rates at the surface and at 1 meter, whichever is applicable. And again, I've never seen departments that don't require both for that radioactive 1 package. If exposure rate exceeds the labeling, then you need to notify the RSO, meaning that it should be labeled as a certain exposure on the paperwork. If you measure it and that is way above that, I'm not talking like, 0.004 and theirs is 0.005 or whatever, but something that's significantly above the exposure rate that it's labeled as, then you need to notify the RSO, because that means something's wrong between the sender and the receiver. And so that needs to be figured out. And once you identify or notify the RSO is the one that will handle that process of getting a hold of the pharmacy or whoever it might be and figuring out the discrepancy. The other thing you'll have to do is you'll need to do a wipe test. So you're going to need to wipe test the external surface of the package. Some departments will also have you do an internal wipe, but in terms of receipt from DOT, you'll do an external wipe. It's supposed to be a surface area of 300 centimeters squared. So if you think about, if you took 300 centimeters and put it out, it's probably about the size of a regular piece of paper. That's about the size it would be. It might be a little smaller than that, but roughly that is. So honestly, when I'm doing it, I'll get my, I'll get like a 2x2 or a 4x4, and I'll just wipe down an entire side of the package, or sometimes I'll wipe down one side, I'll go to another side wipe and just kind of wipe each side of the package. By the time you get that, you're probably somewhere around 300 square centimeters. So in practice, you're just kind of wiping the areas and figuring that out. For test purposes, you need to know that it's 300 square centimeters, okay? And that cannot exceed 6,600 disintegrations per minute. So you're going to take that and you're going to put it in the well counter and measure that, and it can't exceed that 6,600 disintegrations per minute, okay? So again, a couple of more memorizing things right here. After opening, of course, you're going to verify that the contents match the packaging slip, and that's where you're going to look and make sure doses are measured the same and all that kind of stuff. And then, of course, you're going to take that packaging slip, and I didn't list this here because every facility is totally different, but you likely have some form of software in your department that keeps track of dosing for your patients and receiving dosing and of inventory of your doses that you have. And so you're going to have some software that you put that information in. So again, I don't really cover that here because it's totally dependent upon where you work. But that's kind of the process. Now, another thing that will definitely be on boards is understanding that packages have to be received within 3 hours of receipt from wherever is bringing it on regular working hours, or if it's delivered while you're closed, so it's delivered in the middle of the night, you just have to receive the package within 3 hours of opening your department. So regular opening hours, okay? So just remember that 3 hours, gotta get it received within 3 hours of delivery. Okay, so radioactive waste disposal. So again, this is part of, we've received the dose, we've used the dose. How do we get rid of it after that? How do we dispose? So the first one is here is decay and storage. So materials with less than 120-day half-life can be put in storage in your hot lab and decayed. They're kept until they're at background or 10 half-lives. So what that means is that if you do the math on pretty much any nuclide, no matter what the half-life is, by the time 10 half-lives have passed, you're going to be down to background. So you can use either one of those, but if you do the math on any half-life, 10 half-lives will be back to background. And again, a half-life is going to be different depending on the nuclide, right? So I-131 being an 8-day half-life, TEC being a 6-hour half-life, that's going to be very different in terms of how long that is. But either way, either one of those values, either you measure it at background or you go 10 half-lives will get you to background. Anything that's a decay and storage, anything you're storing radioactive material in should be labeled with a date and the longest lived nuclide. So you might have a facility where you kind of just put all of your radioactive storage or waste in one bin. That's fine, but if you're using, say I-131 and you're also using TEC, it has to be labeled according to the I-131 because again, it's going to be the longest lasting, right? And so this is where you usually see most departments separating and having a short-term waste and a long-term waste. And this is the reason, is because with TEC, you can get rid of and dispose of storage containers earlier than you could with I-131. So it makes sense to separate and have a TEC bin and then also have like a long-term bin for those other things, okay? The other thing I wrote on here as part of that getting rid of doses or decaying of storage is that any radioactive label that you have that's associated with your doses has to be defaced before disposal. What I mean by defaced is that radioactive symbol that's on that dose, you can't throw that away in a regular garbage and leave it intact. So you either have to shred that. A lot of departments will take a Sharpie marker and you have to scribble it out. That radioactive symbol can't be, it has to be defaced in some way. It can't be visible or viewable. So either, like I said, either way, you can shred it, you can scribble it out. In our department, I always just have a Sharpie. And so I'll just scribble it out with the Sharpie, and then I actually just go throw it in our shred bin after that. So I kind of hit it from both sides, but they have to be defaced. They can't go into waste and still show a radioactive sign on them. So that's decay and storage. When we're transferring, the other thing you can do with doses is you can transfer them to an authorized recipient. So there might be some areas in which you don't decay and storage at all at your facility, but rather your radio pharmacy or other organizations may take the leftover doses back from you, okay? So with those, this would be like unused unit doses, dose containers that are returned to a radio pharmacy, long-lived waste like expired sealed sources, so the stuff you do with your QC with, they can be transferred to authorized commercial waste handlers. If that's the case, when you're sending stuff back, a package has to be labeled according to the DOT requirements. So let me go back. So that's these, right? The same way that they label a radioactive material to send it to you, you have to do the same thing when you're sending it back to them, which means that you're going to have to measure and survey the package before you send it, and you're going to have to do a wipe before you send it. So likely in your software, when you're sending back your dose containers for the day, if you send stuff back, it's likely going to require that you survey it at the end of the day and know that it's below limits. So all that has to be recorded. Also, again, like when you're done with maybe your sheet source that you use for your gamma camera, eventually that's going to get so low that it isn't worth using on your gamma camera and you're going to get a new one. And so when you send those back, whether that's your hot lab that does it or whether it's a private company that is doing that for you, those processes, you're going to have to measure its exposure. You're going to have to label it according to the DOT, either the 1, the 2, or the 3, the white and the yellow, and put all those same things on when you're sending it out. So it's the same DOT requirements that they have, you also have going back the other way. Another form of getting rid of radioactive waste is sewage disposal. So you can get rid of any radioactive material that is liquid and that is water soluble and dispersible. What that means is that it has to, when I put something in water, it disperses or it spreads out. It can't stay in its form, right? It has to be some sort of radioactivity that will disperse throughout the water. And if you think about that, the reason for that is that, radiation exposure goes up when we have a greater amount and you're close to that amount. So if you put this in the sewage, if it spreads out over the entire sewage system, you just lower that radiation to below background. Okay, so that's the idea, is that you can put liquid in. Again, it has to be water soluble and dispersible. And then the total yearly amount that you put into the sewage system cannot exceed 1 curie. So typically what will happen is your RSO, when they're establishing a department, will come along and give you guidelines for what you can and can't do. And if they have decided that they're going to get rid of some things through sewage, then what they'll have done is a bunch of research to determine, okay, this is the type of thing we're using. This is the type of radiation we're putting in the sewer. This is typically how many patients in this type we see each year. And so they'll do a bunch of calculations to determine whether or not they're over a curie or under a curie, and if that's doable for your facility. So this wouldn't be something that you're calculating yourself and you're like, okay, where am I at on my sewage disposal? It's going to be figured out by the RSO, and they're either going to let you do this or they're not going to let you do this. Likely, if they don't let you do this, it's because they've done all the calculations to determine that you would be over a curie. If they do let you do it, then obviously they've done those same calculations. So don't go to the hot lab now today when you're at your clinicals and start dumping stuff down the sewer. Don't do that. But know this for your boards, that you can use sewage disposal, has to be less than a curie, has to be liquid that is soluble and dispersible. The other one is that radiation can be released to the atmosphere. This mainly applies to xenon. There's really not much else that we do in a gas form besides xenon. And so typically if you do xenon in your department for lung scans, you're going to have a vent hood. You're going to have a hood where xenon is stored. Xenon has to be stored in the vent hood in case there's any kind of leak out of your xenon vial or your container. And vent hoods usually release straight to the atmosphere. So vent hoods don't go anywhere else in the hospital. They usually have a direct route to usually the top of the hospital or somewhere where they release out into the atmosphere. So that can be done. However, what you do want to understand here is that this is for like leaking purposes or anything that might happen. This isn't something we necessarily do on purpose. In other words, you don't take unused xenon that you have, that you're like, well, I got the xenon, we didn't use it, and just pop it open under your vent hood and let it go into the atmosphere. That's not what this is for. So unused xenon has to be decayed in storage. It would go into your decaying storage just like anything else would, and it would decay there. So we can release to atmosphere. So again, just understand the general ideas of how we deal with waste, whether that's what we keep in our department, what we transfer to someone else, and then the sewage in the atmosphere rules or regulations. And we're getting close to being done. I just noticed it's 9:28. So if any of you want to bail and get to your other class, that's totally fine. We'll be done pretty quickly here. We only have a couple more slides left. And so if you need to leave, that's great, but we'll try to hurry and finish up. Okay, we're going to talk about radiation area surveys and wipes. Okay, so this is like the surveys that you all do in the morning. Routine surveys and wipe tests of nuclear medicine facility areas are required if workers are likely to receive more than 10% of allowable limit, or general public is likely to receive more than 0.1 rem in an unrestricted area. So this is where I talked about at the beginning. Usually when your department is established, somebody, RSO, whoever, has done multiple measurements over time and been able to determine this, whether there's likely more than 10% or whether there's not, or whether there's more than point run in an unrestricted area. And so once they've established that, then they'll give you areas that you need to do your surveys on. And so most likely when you go into department, they've listed like, obviously your camera rooms are going to be included on this, your hot lab, most of your nuclear medicine department is going to be included. It's just a question of whether your waiting areas are going to be or not, depending on where they're located and if that's done. But your department should have that established for you, what areas that you need to survey. Now notice that this says routine. I would be willing to put money down that your department has you do this daily. Most departments do. But from the NRC, they just require it to be routine. So they don't actually define what that needs to be. It just needs to be whatever your RSO decides means routine. So, but again, likely in your department, you do them daily, but know that they need to be done. And then the more important thing to know, of course, with this 10% possibility is these two things right here. So the trigger levels for surveys is any unrestricted area can't exceed 0.2 MR per hour. So again, unrestricted would be like your waiting area or something like that. And then a restricted area, so that's most of the areas in your nuclear medicine department. You probably would, this may not include the hallways in your nuclear medicine department, that might be unrestricted. Most nuke med departments have everything restricted. You have to use a badge to get in. So look at that in your department. But unrestricted areas can't be 0.2, and then the restricted areas can't be more than 5 MR per hour. Okay, so those are going to be your trigger levels. If you're above that, then we need to, I would remeasure first and then get RSO or management involved and find out why you're triggering. And then the other one you have to do, again, most places that I see, this is routine. Wipes are also routine. Most places that I've worked do surveys daily, and then they do wipes at least weekly. And so your trigger level with the wipe is it can't be more than 22,000 disintegrations per minute for a 100 square centimeter wipe. So remember I told you it was when you're receiving a dose and we wipe our packages down, that was 300 square centimeter area and it was 6,600 disintegrations per minute. This is for you going around and wiping your different areas of your work area. Those wipes are 2,200 disintegrations per minute and 100 square centimeters. So don't get those two things confused. They're different. One is about packages and one is about your areas that you're surveying, okay? Also a tip for this 100 square meters, I've been told that 100 square meters is probably similar to the size of one of those small radiation signs that comes on your package. That may or may not help since you're doing this when you're in a survey, but again, know that for the test. In practice, you're just going to be going around and wiping the different areas in your camera room and things like that. So you're probably not going to have a great way of knowing you've done 100 square centimeters in practice. But again, for the test, you need to know these. Two more slides here. So this one is about the release of patients that are administered radioactive materials. So this would be like doing I-131 therapies or other therapy treatments. The NRC allows the release of patients who have been administered radioactive material if the exposure from the release of the patient will not exceed 500 millirem or 5 millisieverts to any individual member of the public or individual's immediate family. So it's not necessarily that we're thinking 500 millirem and 5 millisieverts for the patient themselves. It's, are they giving off enough of a dose that they're going to expose somebody else to those things, okay? So it needs to be below 500 millirem or 5 millisieverts. If a person is likely to receive 100 millirem or 1 millisievert from the patient, then the patient must be given written instructions on minimizing exposure to others. So this is where if you do I-131 treatments in your department, you likely have a set of instructions that you give your patient for when they have the treatment. They used to require that people who were getting I-131 treatments either be kept in the hospital and put in a room so these things could be observed, or there were even times I know where patients would be required to get like a hotel room and stay in their hotel room so they weren't around each other. Most places now have brought that down to where you can stay at your home, but they're going to give you a bunch of instructions like, okay, for X amount of days, you're going to be alone in a certain room in your house, and you're going to extremely limit your exposure to other people. Stuff that you eat with, you're going to use all disposable, like disposable plate, disposable forks, whatever. You're going to flush your toilet twice. You're going to do all those things. So there's going to be these instructions that are given to the patient depending on the type of therapy you do. I'm not teaching you those individually because they're going to be based on what your radiation safety officer and radiation safety committee and probably your authorized user have probably come up with a protocol if you do therapies, and they're going to have individual instructions for your patients, and those might vary slightly from facility to facility. So you don't need to necessarily know all those intricate instructions, but you do need to know the things I've listed on the slide here in terms of the limits and the likely exposure to other people. There's 3 methods for determining patient release eligibility. They differ depending on the nuclide that you use. So one of them is just if we've administered a certain amount of activity of a certain nuclide, then again, they can determine, the RSO and your facility has already predetermined that these limits are either not met or they are met just based on administered activity. The other one you can do is you can actually measure your patient. And so a lot of facilities do that as well. They'll kind of have an idea of if it's above a certain amount of millicuries that you're giving for, say, I-131, that you're going to actually measure your dose or measure your patient with a meter before they leave and determine the dose rate coming off the patient. Or a lot of facilities also have what's called a specific dose calculation. And so you'll have some paperwork that has, like we have, when we do like a liver treatment with TheraSphere at our hospital. I haven't done them in a long time because I'm just in cardiology. But a liver treatment will have we have paperwork that we go through, and you put in all these numbers and it gives you a calculation, and it's patient specific, and it'll say, okay, this patient's good or not good to be released. I would refer you to Waterstrom page 123. There's a couple of tables, and you can get a good idea of different treatments and what those look like. So take a look at that. But generally, I would understand these 2 bullet points up here. Okay, we got 1 slide left, and that's just radioactive spill procedure. I will tell you that this procedure is also going to be something that's established by your radiation safety committee, radiation safety officer. So you should have a procedure. Go and look for it. Ask your techs about it. Likely it's posted in the hot lab. What I've given you here is kind of an example. You'll even notice that if you look in your review book and then you look in Waterstrom, the general ideas are the same, but it's not so specific, right? So I think for your testing purposes, you need to generally understand how to take care of a radioactive spill. One of the main things is going to be labeling radioactive spills in certain occasions, but take a look at the different books, and then I've given you kind of a combo on the slide here, but I'll hurry and go through that with you, and then we'll end. But the general procedure that you have is you're going to want to, if you have a radioactive spill, you're going to want to clear the area because you don't want people cruising through.
Yes.
Somebody's not muted. You don't want people coming through the area and spreading radiation around. Also, you know, radiation safety for individuals. So we want to clear the area. You're going to notify a supervisor or the RSO and let them be involved because they'll be in charge of making sure things are documented and things like that. You want to contain the spill with absorbent paper. With radioactivity, if you've ever had a spill and you start trying to come in and wipe things and do stuff, it goes everywhere. So think absorb, don't think wipe. You start wiping, you start spreading radiation, try to absorb. So absorbent paper, absorbent towels, absorbent things is what we want to get with first, because if we can absorb it up and then we can take that and put it in decay and storage. If it's high in radioactivity, you can attempt to shield the source, like with some lead bricks or something like that. If it's something that's more on the higher side, you're going to evaluate the severity. So a couple of things to think about with severity is this spill widespread? In other words, it's something that's gotten over an entire room. So it's not just a little teeny thing on the floor, but it's like there's radioactivity everywhere. So that would be widespread or really high radiation levels. So some isotope that gives off a lot of radiation and maybe has a longer half-life, right, is spilled, then you definitely need to include the RSO in the cleanup because they may have more specific things that need to be done, depending on if it's widespread or it's high radiation. The next one is decontaminate personnel. So one of the reasons that in nuclear medicine we wear lab coats is so that we can take them off if we spill radiation on ourselves, right? Because when you decontaminate, you need to remove outer clothing. You need to get, the best thing you could do is if you have radiation on you is simply just remove it, right? So that's one of the important reasons for wearing a lab coat or some kind of jacket, whatever your facility provides, is that you need to be able to get rid of that. Then you're going to wash skin with soap and water, or likely your facility has a commercial decontamination agent. So they have there's certain products that are have an affinity to bind to radioactive materials. And so instead of just plain soap and water, you may have a commercial decontamination agent that is better at getting things off. That may be you have a commercial agent that you can use on yourself. And there's also commercial agents that you can use when you spray the radioactive spill and then try to absorb it up. So ask about that in your department. They likely have a lot of your departments probably have an entire kit for radioactive spills, but they'll probably at least have that commercial decontamination agent somewhere. So then we're going to want to decontaminate people, and then we're going to want to decontaminate the spill area. Again, wash with that commercial agent, use absorbency. Something I probably should have mentioned from the get-go is gloves. Of course, you're going to do all this with gloves so you don't get it on your hands. All materials need to be placed in a plastic bag and disposed of in radioactive waste. So the same as you would dispose of radioactivity, all of those rules apply when you're decontaminating a spill. So they may need to decay in storage, depending on the isotope and so on and so forth, and the 10 half-life rule or the background rule. When you've done all that and you've kind of cleaned the area as good as possible, then you have to survey for any remaining activity. And then if there is remaining activity that's above background, then you're going to want to cover that with an absorbent paper of some kind. You're going to need to label it radioactive material and label that with a date. I have had some people also put what it's measuring as on that date so that you can, if you need to then continue to measure it till it's to background, you can kind of see if it's coming down. So you're going to want to survey and label it. And that's probably going to be the one thing on here that would be a very I could see being a test question, is understanding that if you have a radioactive spill that's been cleaned up, it needs to be covered and labeled. And then the last one is write up a report, describe the accident, all the actions used to clean up the spill. This may not be something you do depending on the involvement of your RSO, but I would encourage you to talk to your facility and find out what kind of reporting that your facility requires when there's a radioactive spill. It could be that your facility, if it's like tech and it's a small cleanup job and you're able to contain it, that they don't require it, but they might. So again, I don't want to give you that. Just check with your individual facility. So that's how we deal with a radioactive spill. And with that, I'm done. That's all I've got for you today. Any questions, concerns?
Yeah, I have one question for you, Mike.
Yeah.
Hey, on the other class, you said there was a video. I see a spot where there's supposed to be a video, but I have not seen a video posted there.
Are you talking about for our boards review class?
Yes, sir.
Oh, well, that's not good. That's not good at all. Let's look at it right now. I really hope that is not the case, because I want you guys to be able to get started. Let me look here real quick. I'm not sharing my screen anymore, right? Went out.
No, you're not.
Okay, let me 1 second and I will pull it up and see what it looks like from my end. Okay, so I'm going to change this to student view because I can see it. I see it. And let me just share screen real quick.
You can find that video too, just on YouTube, right? Just under, I think it's like Mike Nuke Med or Nike.
Yeah,
And you're
yeah,
just subscriber.
it does all attach to my NukeMed, and it should be publicly viewable right now. Sometimes I keep my stuff privately viewable, but when we get to this point in the program, I try to just open up all my videos. So they should all be just public right now. Let me share. Can you guys see my screen?
Yeah.
I can.
So I'm in student view here, and it should be located right here in introduction view, but you're saying you're not seeing it?
Give me 1 second. Let me pull it up and see if it has arrived.
Yeah, let me know. If not, I'll try to send you an individual link or something like that, because definitely got to be able to view that.
I've got a couple questions for you too, Mike, when he's finished up with you.
Okay, no problem.
Well, I'm sorry, Mike. I'm a bonehead. It was a drop-down link that I didn't see I needed to click on to get to it.
Oh, no worries,
Sorry
man. No,
about
I'm glad you brought it up. I am known to be a little bit of an airhead sometimes. Like I'll do stuff like that. I'll post the main heading and then forget to make the link active or something stupid. So I really like it when you guys keep me responsible and honest. So it's fine. Yeah, no worries.
Thank you very much, man. You've been very knowledgeable, and thank
Yeah.
you for giving us all this information.
No problem. No problem. Joe, was it you that had some questions?
Yeah. So with the presentation, we've
Mhm.
got the two sections that we were assigned.
Yep.
Are we doing the presentation portion so on both of those sections that we were assigned?
Yeah, so I want you to do the notes that you're gonna send to me, and I'll compile. I want those to be separate for the sections, and then
Okay.
you're also gonna do a PowerPoint for both sections, and be prepared to do both sections of the review. Now, I will say from the get-go, I want you to keep in mind that the process of doing this, of doing the notes and doing a PowerPoint and being ready to teach, is one of the most important parts, because it's making you deep dive into something. And it's just a really good way to realize if you have to be prepared to teach something, you really know it.
Right.
And so it's a method to use to prepare for your boards. I've had on more than one occasion that we get doing these presentations, and we may not get to your second one actually presenting it in class just because our time's limited. And so typically, that's why if you watch the comprehensive review video, I talk about how we start with procedures, because procedures is the most amount of questions on your
Okay.
test. And then we go up to instrumentation and so on and so forth. I do it that way just in case we don't get through. Most years we get through most of it, but there are some years we don't. So I don't want you to be upset that you prepared something and you might be one of those later ones and we don't get to doing your second one. Understand that the main purpose is learning it. But yeah, does that answer your question?
It does. So if I'm doing the PowerPoint, like my first section is the ethical and legal aspects, and I've got my whole set of information lined out. I'm doing a PowerPoint on that portion.
Okay.
And then am I doing a second PowerPoint on the other stuff that you would,
Yeah.
the other section? It's not like into one big giant PowerPoint, because you said like about a 10-minute long presentation. I didn't know.
Yeah, so those just 10-minute long, the limit we want to give for each one of your sections is 10 minutes. So when we get to class, we're just going to go one by one and let you get up and do your presentation. So, you'll do one section, another. It doesn't matter if you
The
have
two
your
separate PowerPoints?
Yeah. I mean, even if you have them together, it's fine. But
We're
when
gonna cover
it's
one
your
at a
turn to
time.
do your first section, you'll go through the first section, and then
Okay.
someone else's turn, and we'll get to it the second half when we get to it. So I
Gotcha.
mean, it's fine if you have them together. And your PowerPoint is not something you're turning into me. It's just your tool as you teach. The thing
Okay.
you're turning into me that I do want separated is the
Review notes?
Yeah,
Okay. And then
Yeah.
so one more thing, I'm sorry to keep
you're
you here.
fine. No, these are all good things. Everybody's learning right now.
So I'm gathering all my information on my stuff. Can I copy and paste straight out of like AMA and these articles, like the National Health or the Institution of Health,
Yes.
into my PowerPoint for my teachings, as long as I'm staying current and knowledgeable on these subjects, but I can
Yeah.
take all their information out of these sites and put them into my PowerPoint?
Absolutely. We're not gonna put this anywhere else. This is just
Right.
for our class and our purposes. So
That's kind of what I was
yeah,
figuring. I wanted to make sure that
absolutely.
wasn't
And I'm not, I'm not looking to see if you've copied from something else. That's fine. We just want information for
right.
our class. So I'm
Okay.
not worried about any of that kind of stuff. And this isn't going anywhere. So yeah, you're okay
Cool.
doing that for sure.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Great question.
Cool. That wraps up what I had.
Okay, thanks, Joe. That was probably helpful for everybody. So thanks.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Mike.
Yep. Anybody else? Okay. Well, if there's no other questions, then again, get working on those assignments that we're going to need before we get to class. I believe it's the 3rd that I wanted your notes due. I have to have a chance to get those notes and put them together and then post them up on Canvas so you guys can have them to use for the class. Other than that, I'm excited to see y'all.
With those notes too, Mike. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's okay.
Um,
Thanks.
We're just hammering out like I was telling you earlier, mine's the ethical and legal aspects. I'm just basically giving notes in depth on each of those points within that.
Yeah, so I'm thinking more like simple bullet point type notes. Like essentially the idea is you're gonna have this for when you're studying boards. So they don't have to get super detailed, but like kind of bullet points of okay, here's all the things that I need to remember for boards, that kind of thing. Just what you would normally do in notes. I know that's sort of vague a little bit, but the idea is just so that you have a place to quickly review. Okay, when I talk about legal aspects, what are the things I'm going to remember for my boards? Okay, here's almost like flashcardy type thing. Obviously, they're not flashcards, but just simple, easy bullet points. You may have more detail on your slides and what you talk about, but then you're going to have these notes that kind of go along with it. Yeah.
Okay, because I was kind of trying to kill almost 2 birds with 1 stone type of thing. I've got all this information on this stuff for my slides. I can also incorporate it into my notes in a more or less detailed way, maybe.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Simplified.
Yep.
Cool.
I like it.
Right on. Thank you so much. I appreciate that, Mike.
Of course. Yep, no problem. Okay. If there's nothing else, I'm gonna let us go.
Cool. Thanks, Mike. Appreciate you.
I have a quick question.
Absolutely. Shoot.
So the part of the manual where everything's step by step, you want us to write out like every little thing that we do?
Are you talking about the quality control?
Yeah.
Yeah, so just I want to know when the quality control is required, so daily, weekly, monthly. And so if you listed like your gamma camera, you might say, okay, we do 5 million floods daily. And then you'll just say, you might just do a brief explanation of here's how you do a flood. What if you were a tech and you were new, like what do they want done in this department? And then you might say, okay, this is what we do weekly, and then this is how you do it, and this is what we do monthly, and this is how you do it.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
No problem. All right. I'm going to end it. See you guys later.